Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 2 of our Frozen Sick D&D campaign. We find ourselves in Palebank Village as the sun rises. Romand Hammergrace, the dwarven paladin of Torm, which I guess would be more widely known as the Lawbearer or the Lawgiver in this setting, wakes from his rest in the home of some of Ergen Went's relations who are making their preparations for the funeral to be held that day. He's given a robust stone-bread loaf by old Granny Wenthe, and makes his way back across the village to the Jolly Dwarf Inn, where he previously made arrangements to meet up with the fellows he found in the bar the other night. Roman takes a seat and orders a bit more breakfast. The tavern is pretty quiet, only a few customers, people probably staying at the inn, and there aren't many of those in this rather far-flung and out-of-the-way settlement. But it isn't long before Irina slips stealthily past the rooms where Zarissa and Vlad were staying and joins him. They strike up courteous conversation and are shortly joined by Vlad and Zarissa, and the group all remake their acquaintances. They have a little time before the funeral is due to begin, and Vlad mentions that he needs to pick up some extra gear, having travelled the roads rather light, and Irina, who's been in the village of Palebank for about a week, offers to show him the way to the local smithy. The two trudge through the early morning streets to Doran's forge. They meet Doran Snowbeard in the process of lighting his forge and getting ready his tools for the day. The old dwarf is gruff but not impolite and takes the two into his shop, shows his wares. Vlad buys a warhammer and a suit of chainmail. They inquire about magic items, and Doran informs them that those kind of items are few and far between outside Utherderm in this region, but lets slip that maybe he's got a pet project or two that he hopes might come to something in the future. On the way back to the tavern, the two stop by a bread and bakery stall at the village market, and Vlad purchases a small sack of pastries. They reconvene with Zarissa and Romand at the Jolly Dwarf, and after a few preparatory drinks, head off to the village graveyard for the day's sombre event. Most of the villagers turned out for Ergen Went's funeral, but they managed to establish themselves a decent spot somewhat near the grave. As the procession, where Ergen Went's remaining family proceed with his casket through the graveyard, the group are joined by Klaus, who greets them quietly, giving Romand a nod of condolence for his loss. Zarissa hasn't really altered her wardrobe to match the conditions of the weather, which is overcast, quite grim, with a dreary drizzle of rain and a biting wind, or the fact that she's attending a funeral, but surprisingly seems completely unfazed by conditions that have many in the crowd shivering and stamping their feet, despite wearing much more sensible winter gear. The dwarven priest leading the funeral gives a sombre eulogy, and as the casket is lowered into the grave, most of the party, except Zarissa, who appears to be checking out other members of the congregation, are able to see within the casket, which is open, and notice the strangely contorted form of the body of Ergen Wenthe, coloured a strange, translucent blue, lined with a deeper blue vasculature, in a strange melding of ice and flesh, curled as if desperately trying to conserve heat, one hand reaching in a rigor mortis, grasped towards something unknown, and an expression locked in one of teeth-chattering agony. As the crowd begins to disband after the funeral concludes, the party are approached by a stern and weathered-looking elf. He introduces himself as Elro Aldatur, leader of the Palebank community. He explains that he's heard of the group's antics the previous night, and is impressed by their apparent strength and competency in dealing with confrontation with tact and expediency. He tells the group that he has a proposition, and wants to know if he can hire them to look into the matter of Ergen Went's unusual death. Romand Hammergrace is immediately keen to resist, as this is his reason for travelling to Palebank Village in the first place. After what she has just seen of Ergen Wenthe, Irina is impulsively curious and intrigued to find out more, whilst Zarissa and Klaus's ears prick up at the mention of money. Vlad doesn't really say much and plays his cards rather close to his chest. Elro raises an eyebrow to see Klaus as part of the group, and it seems the Tabaxi does not have a sterling reputation among the Palebank law authorities. But Klaus merely shrugs and says, "You have coin, Klaus has time." And Zarissa interjects to confirm that the offer of payment is 100 gold for the whole party rather than say each. To which Elro replies that 100 gold is not a meagre offering from this small community. As the party inquire further about the details of the job, they learn the following. Ergen Wenth was a local adventurer who spent the season past in Islecross and returned a couple of months ago. Shortly after his return, Wenth began to exhibit symptoms. They started off with flu-like symptoms, but he progressively became unable to feel warm, developing unsettling blue veins and slowing motion, until eventually he was found frozen solid in his cabin earlier that week. Elro had encouraged Ergen to isolate and arranged local clergy to try to treat him. For some reason, the divine power of the clerics had no effect, and Wenth continued to deteriorate. Elro began to suspect that the dwarf had fallen under some sort of curse in his travels. In the last few days, however, it has come to Elro's attention that another member of the community, a trapper called Tolgi Lutan, is exhibiting the same ominous symptoms as Ergen showed, and he now fears that whatever it is may be spreading among the local population. His glass braids are spread thin at the current time, although he doesn't reveal by what, and are rather out of their depth in investigating such phenomena. Elro wants the party to bring him information on the cause or nature of this strange blight, or else anything he can use to meaningfully protect the village from it. Elro suggests that two places the party may begin their investigation are in Ergen Wenth's cabin, which might contain clues as to his encounters in Islecross, or to go and talk to Tolgi Lutan and get her to open up as to where she might have acquired this horrible affliction. With the party agreeing to undertake the investigation, Elro bids them good luck and leaves them to their own devices. Although it's only roughly midday, Romand is determined that they first abide by dwarf tradition and spend the rest of the day drinking to Ergen's memory in the tavern. The next day, the party start their investigation. They decide that Ergen's cabin isn't going anywhere, so they decide to talk to Tolgi to see what she knows. Klaus has worked in the village for the past year and is familiar with the village layout, so he leads the way to Tolgi's cabin. They knock on the door and are rudely rebuffed, especially when they mention that they might be working with Elro. Roman demonstrates that despite possessing a noble heart, he is a dwarf of action who is happy to play by his own rules, and as soon as they encounter resistance from Tolgi, he immediately demands that the team break down the door. He leads by example, attempting to kick down the door, but slips in the frosty mud, almost landing himself on his buttocks. Vlad steps up and begins kicking at the door. Klaus mutters something about maybe being able to have a look at the lock, but the dwarves aren't interested, and after a few hearty boots, the wooden frame around the lock splinters, and the party are able to force their way inside. The group enter the cabin and are immediately attacked by Tolgi, who gets up slowly from her bed on the other side of the intensely hot cabin, and screaming at them to get out, advances on the group with a dagger drawn. Klaus darts around to flank her with an arrow drawn in his short bow, but Romand and Irina rein him in and call for the party to try to restrain their opponent. As he enters, Vlad fumbles a detect magic spell as the rest of the party all advance on the startled dwarfen lady, all shouting at her to stand down, augmented by Zarissa's thaumaturgy, which also causes all sources of fire from the fireplace and braziers in the cabin to flare ominously. In her vulnerable condition, this sudden assault by an armed group wielding devilish powers, all shouting at her is too much for Tolgi, and thanks to some high intimidation checks, she relents before it comes to actual blows. The party question her on her connection to Ergen, but she isn't very forthcoming other than telling them that she seems to have the same condition that claimed Wenth, but she doesn't know how she got it. Klaus has heard that Tolgi runs with a rather shady group, and further probing by the group get her to spill her guts. They learn that Tolgi's sister, Hulil Lutan, is the leader of a group of local bandits with connections to a crime family in Shady Creek Run, a settlement of ne'er-do-wells to the south on the boundaries of the Savalier Wood and the Empire. The party do not learn the name of this crime family, however. Tolgi tells them that the bandits operate out of Croker Cave, a feature not far from Palebank Village, which the villagers give a wide berth. Tolgi found out that Ergen sold his loot to Pelk's Curiosities shop a bit over a month ago, shortly after which she stole the artifacts via a bit of burglary and passed most of them on to Halil. She hasn't had much contact with Halil since. She suspects she contracted her condition from handling the treasures that Ergen brought back from Islecross, and relinquishes her dagger to Romand, who identifies it as an artifact of Aor, a fabled flying city from the Age of Arcanum that crashed during the Calamity and has recently been rediscovered, shattered and strewn across Islecross. Irina suggests that they treat the dagger with caution, and the group carefully melt some candle wax and encase the dagger for safe transport. Tolgi begs the party to find a cure for her, and Romand agrees, and the group takes their leave, a little guilty about the state of the door, but enthused by the fact that they have a potentially interesting lead and have once more managed to avoid murdering local citizens. The heroes decide next that they were going to search Ergen's cabin. Klaus once again leads the way, and they get there to find it guarded by a half-elf glassblade who's standing at a conspicuous distance from the property and allows them entry without much trouble, as she's been informed by Elro that the group are heading an investigation on his orders. The group search the cabin, which has clearly been ransacked. Irina badly stubs her toe on the displaced furniture, and Klaus ends up transfixed by a wind chime, and so neither of them are very much use in the investigation. Zarissa spends most of her time looking at the head mounted over the dwarven bed, unable to imagine what manner of creature it could have come from. The dwarves of the group fare a bit better and have the intuition that the cabin was likely turned over by Tolgi or her gang looking for more loot or clues that might help them treat the condition. In the course of their search, they find Ergen's adventuring equipment, a silvered maul, some armour and clothing sized for a dwarf, a grappling hook, and a lantern. Romand also finds a receipt from Pelt's Curiosities, listing the items sold as a dagger, a scroll case, a jade statuette, some arrows, a silver ring set with jasper, and 2 blue glass vials. The session ends as the party consider their next move. So that was session 2. It was good fun. A lot of laughs had, and the characters are really starting to develop personality already. Our sessions are 2 hours long, and quite weighted towards banter between the characters, so the pacing is probably a bit slower than it otherwise might be, although the combat sequences such as they have been were pretty short. So yeah, catch you on the next one.